There are no houses, no streets, no rooftops, nothing that suggests a city ever stood there. But just minutes before this barren landscape existed, nearly 20,000 people were living their lives in this very place. The town still lies beneath those palms today, buried under a hardened mass of rock, mud, and ice, deep enough in some areas to swallow a 10-story building. The Peruvian government didn't simply abandon the site after the disaster. They made a decision that still stands today. Digging here is illegal. The entire area is officially considered a mass grave. What makes the tragedy even chilling is that the disaster wasn't completely unexpected. Nearly 8 years before the catastrophe, 2 American geologists had warned that this exact scenario could happen. Their warning was ignored. To understand why, you have to picture the geography. In northern Peru lies a narrow valley known as Callejón de Huaylas. Thousands of people lived along its fertile floor, including the residents of a city called Yungay. The town rested peacefully between towering Andean peaks. High above the valley loomed Huascaran Norte, a massive mountain that reaches more than 22,000 feet into the sky. That's significantly taller than Mount Whitney, the highest peak in the contiguous United States. And Huascaran carried something dangerous: centuries of accumulated glacial ice. Between the city and the mountain stood what locals believed was their natural shield. A massive ridge of solid rock called Cerro Aira rose roughly 460 feet above the valley floor. From below, it looked like an impenetrable barrier, a wall of stone taller than a 40-story skyscraper. To the residents of Yungay and the officials responsible for the region, that ridge was proof the city was safe. Even if something came down from the mountain, they believed, the ridge would block it. But that belief relied on one critical assumption. It assumed the mountain would only send something small. In 1962, American geologists David Bernays and Charles Sawyer were studying the glacier high above the valley. During their research, they discovered something alarming beneath the ice. Hidden inside the mountain was a huge fractured mass of granite. The rock formation was deeply cracked and partially detached, hanging precariously above the glacier like a loose tooth waiting to fall. If that block ever collapsed, the scientists concluded it would trigger a massive avalanche of rock, ice, and debris, and the volume would be enormous. Their calculations suggested that if the mass broke free, the avalanche would gather so much material and momentum that the 460-foot ridge would not stop it. Instead, the debris flow would likely surge over the ridge and continue straight toward Yungay. The warning was clear and direct, but the government didn't treat it as a scientific concern. Instead, it became a political problem. Officials feared that acknowledging the danger could create panic and damage the region's economy. So rather than investigating further, authorities moved to suppress discussion of the report. Legal pressure was applied to silence the geologists. Public statements dismissed the findings as exaggerated speculation. In short, the danger was brushed aside. The mountain remained unstable, but the warning disappeared. And life in Yungay continued. The town grew, families built homes, markets thrived, children played in the streets. For years, nothing happened. Then came Sunday, May 31st, 1970. At 3:23 in the afternoon, the calm valley was suddenly shaken by one of the most powerful earthquakes in Peru's recorded history. A magnitude 7.9 earthquake ruptured beneath the Pacific Ocean just off the coast. The ground across the region began to shake violently. Most destructive earthquakes last around 15 seconds. This one lasted 45. It felt endless. In Yungay, buildings made from adobe, sun-dried clay bricks couldn't withstand the violent movement. Walls cracked, then burst outward. Heavy clay roofs collapsed instantly, crushing everything beneath them. A thick cloud of dust rose into the air so quickly that it blocked the afternoon sunlight. People rushed outside, stumbling into streets filled with debris and darkness. Many believed they had already experienced the worst part of the disaster, but something far more dangerous had just begun high above them. About 30 seconds into the earthquake, more than 18,000 feet up the western face of Huascaran Norte, the fractured rock mass identified by Bernays finally failed. The entire section of mountain broke loose. What fell initially was an unimaginable block of rock and glacial ice, roughly 265 million cubic feet in volume. To visualize that scale, imagine compressing 7 Empire State Buildings into one enormous chunk of debris. Gravity took over. As the collapsing mass slammed into the glacier below, it shattered and accelerated down the steep slope. Under the immense pressure and friction, something unusual began to happen. The ice started to melt. The avalanche transformed. Instead of behaving like a slow landslide, the mixture of rock, ice, and meltwater created a nearly frictionless base. The debris began moving with terrifying efficiency, similar to how a car hydroplanes on a wet highway. Except this was not a car. It was a moving mountain. As the avalanche raced downhill, it began swallowing everything in its path. Boulders, snowfields, glacial lakes, and loose sediment were all absorbed into the growing flow. Within minutes, the mass had multiplied in size. What started as 265 million cubic feet rapidly expanded into nearly 3.5 billion cubic feet of debris. That's enough material to bury all of Manhattan under 5 feet of rock, and it was moving incredibly fast. Across the 9-mile distance between the mountain and Yungay, the avalanche surged forward at an average speed of roughly 270 to 210 miles per hour. In the narrow chute near the top of the slope, some estimates suggest it reached speeds exceeding 280 miles per hour, faster than many race cars. Down in the valley, the people of Yungay had no idea what was coming. The earthquake had ended, the dust was settling, and the mountain above them had just begun to fall.
At 3:26 p.m., the avalanche reached the massive rock ridge that everyone believed would protect Yungay. For years, that ridge had been seen as an unbreakable natural barrier. But at the speed the debris was moving, the ridge did not act like a shield. It acted like a ramp. When the avalanche slammed into the rock wall at nearly 200 miles per hour, its enormous momentum carried it upward and over the ridge. Instead of stopping the disaster, the barrier launched part of the flow directly into the valley below. The very formation that had convinced everyone the city was safe had now become the final step in its destruction. Down in Yungay, something strange began to happen before the debris even arrived. The sky suddenly turned black, not from storm clouds, but from the massive cloud of dust racing ahead of the avalanche. The air itself seemed to darken as hurricane-force winds pushed a wall of debris through the valley. One scientist who happened to be working in the region that day later described the moment in a brief but haunting sentence in his report. The sky went dark and Yungay disappeared. Another witness recalled the sound. He said it was like hundreds of jet engines roaring at once, screaming across the sky just overhead. First came the wind, then the dust, and then the mountain itself. The avalanche crashed into Yungay with unimaginable force. At 3:27 p.m., only 4 minutes after the earthquake began, the city was gone. Entire neighborhoods vanished beneath a crushing wave of rock, mud, and ice. The central plaza, the cathedral, homes, markets, schools, everything was swallowed by debris in seconds. In some areas, the avalanche buried the town under dozens of feet of hardened material. By the next morning, the mass had already begun to solidify. The mixture of crushed rock and mud hardened almost like concrete, sealing the ruins of the city beneath it. The earthquake damaged Yungay, but the avalanche erased it. And yet, unbelievably, a few people survived. Scattered across the wreckage, small pockets of life remained. Their survival came down to a single factor: elevation. Above the city stood a hill known as Cerro Mirador, where the municipal cemetery was located. At the top of the hill stood a large white statue of Christ, known locally as Cristo Blanco. When the earthquake began and strange sounds echoed from the mountain, some residents instinctively ran uphill toward the cemetery. Those who reached the higher terraces were spared. The avalanche scoured away the lower sections of the hillside, but the upper steps remained just high enough to escape the main flow. About 90 people stood there helplessly as the avalanche roared through the valley below them. From that hilltop, they watched their entire city disappear. Elsewhere, another group survived for a very different reason. Near the eastern side of Yungay stood a small sports ground called Estadio Fernández. That afternoon, the stadium was preparing for a special event. A traveling circus was scheduled to perform at 3:30 p.m. Because it was Sunday, many children had arrived early to secure good seats. Some came without their parents, who were still shopping or resting at home in the town center. When the earthquake struck at 3:23 p.m., around 260 children and teachers were already gathered at the stadium. The location happened to sit on slightly higher ground. 7 minutes before the circus show was supposed to begin, the avalanche swept through the valley below them. The children watched in terror as the dust cloud consumed the town beneath the stadium. They had no time to escape, but they didn't need to. By pure chance, they were standing in one of the few places the avalanche did not reach. In the years after the disaster, a story began to spread. According to local legend, one of the circus performers, a clown named Cucharita, had helped guide the children to safety. The story claimed he led them up the hill, keeping them together like a Pied Piper while the avalanche destroyed the city. But historians have never found any documents from 1970 confirming this version of events. Some survivors later said several children actually tried to run back down toward the city when they realized their parents were still there. Those who ran downhill never returned. The truth behind the legend may never be fully known, but one fact remains certain. The children who stayed at the stadium survived. The avalanche did not stop at Yungay. After burying the city, the massive flow continued moving through the valley until it reached the Santa River. The debris temporarily dammed the river before breaking through and sending another destructive surge rushing downstream. That secondary flood traveled more than 100 miles through the region. Across the broader Ancash region, the earthquake and the disasters that followed killed an estimated 66,000 to 70,000 people. For several days after the catastrophe, the buried town of Yungay could not be reached by road. When aerial photographers finally flew over the area, they saw something haunting. A vast gray plain stretched across the valley. There were no buildings, no streets, no signs of a city. Only 4 palm trees standing above the rubble. Those trees had once lined the Plaza de Armas, the central square of Yungay. Now their crowns were the only visible markers of where the town had stood. The photograph taken from the air needed almost no caption. It simply read, "Aquí Yungay." Here was Yungay. But the disaster created another strange problem. The avalanche had buried not only the city, but also its civil records. Birth certificates, property records, and identification documents were all entombed beneath the debris. Some survivors who escaped the disaster later faced a bizarre legal challenge. On paper, they no longer existed. Many spent years in court trying to prove their identity and reclaim their legal status. The mountain destroyed the city in 4 minutes, but bureaucracy took years to finish the job. Finally, in October 1977, the Peruvian government made a permanent decision about the site. The 246-acre area where Yungay once stood was officially declared a national burial ground. Building was banned, excavation was forbidden, and entry to the area was strictly limited. The government did not create the graveyard. Nature had done that in 1970. Ironically, the same authorities who had dismissed the scientists' warning years earlier were the ones who signed the order sealing the city beneath the ground forever. 15 years, 2 official decisions, and between them lay the fate of 20,000 lives. Today, the ruins of Yungay remain untouched beneath the hardened debris. The terraces of the cemetery still climb the hillside. The statue of Cristo Blanco still looks out over the silent valley. And in the center of the gray plain, 4 palm trees still mark the place where a city once stood.